Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in again. Tonight, we're jumping into some unsettling, true horror stories that'll make you think twice about everyday encounters. So get comfortable, or maybe not too comfortable, and let's get started.
I was working late at the diner, a small, dimly lit place on the edge of town. The regulars came in for their midnight coffee and greasy fries, and most nights were uneventful. But one particularly chilly night, just as I was about to close up, a homeless man stumbled through the door. He looked wild, hair matted and clothes torn, with a desperate look in his eyes. "Please, can I have a coffee?" he asked, his voice shaky but urgent. I hesitated. Our policy was strict about giving food to non-paying customers, but something in his eyes made me relent. "Sure, just one cup," I said, pouring him a small cup. He thanked me profusely and sat at the counter, his hands trembling around the warm mug. As he sipped, I tried to keep my distance, but he started talking, sharing stories that were equal parts rambling and coherent. He talked about the city, the shelters, and the dangers lurking in the dark alleys. I listened, half interested, but then he mentioned something that sent chills down my spine. "There are things you don't know about the people out here," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be listening. "Some of them are predators. They'll take what they want without a second thought." I tried to shrug it off as paranoia, but the diner was eerily quiet, and his stories were unnerving. He spoke of a group that preyed on the vulnerable, luring them in with promises of safety before turning on them. He recounted tales of disappearances, people vanishing without a trace, and I felt my heart race. Just then, the bell above the door jingled, and two men walked in, both with menacing glares and a confident swagger. They sat down at the booth furthest from us, but I could feel their eyes on us. The homeless man tensed, his expression shifting from friendly to terrified in an instant. "They're here," he whispered, eyes wide. "You have to help me. They'll kill me if they see me." I looked over at the men, who were now staring directly at us, a sinister smirk on their faces. My instincts screamed at me to get out, but I felt a strange obligation to help the man who had already fallen into the depths of despair. "Just go through the back door," I whispered back, my heart pounding as I pointed toward the kitchen. But before he could respond, one of the men got up, moving toward us with a deliberate swagger. "Hey, buddy," he sneered, looking at the homeless man. "You shouldn't be here." The man stood, backing away slightly. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice trembling. But the aggressor stepped closer, pushing him against the counter. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the phone under the register, ready to call the police, but my hand was shaking too much to dial. I had to do something.
Suddenly, the homeless man reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife, brandishing it with surprising confidence. "Get away from me!" he shouted, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. The other man froze, surprise morphing into rage. "You think you can threaten us?" he spat, stepping forward again. But the homeless man didn't waver. "You don't want to know what I'm capable of," he said, breathing heavily. I could see the fear and desperation in the homeless man's eyes, mixed with a newfound resolve. The two men looked at each other, realizing they might have underestimated their opponent. Then, chaos erupted. The man lunged at the homeless man, and I instinctively screamed. The second man jumped in, and before I knew it, I was witnessing a terrifying struggle, the diner echoing with shouts and the sound of glass shattering. I scrambled to dial 911, but as I turned back, the scene was a blur of movement. In a split second, the homeless man got the upper hand, driving the blade into one of the attackers. The man crumpled to the ground, and the other one bolted out of the diner, panic evident on his face. The homeless man stood there, breathing heavily, knife glistening in the fluorescent light. I could hardly process what had just happened. Moments later, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. The homeless man turned to me, a wild look in his eyes. "You have to tell them it was self-defense. I didn't want this." As the police arrived, I realized how quickly things had escalated. The night that started as a simple act of kindness had turned into a nightmare, leaving me questioning everything I thought I knew about the world outside my diner. In the end, the man was taken away, and I was left alone in the aftermath, haunted by the darkness that lurked not just in the alleys, but also in the hearts of people you thought you could trust.
It was a frigid December night when I decided to volunteer at a local homeless shelter. As a college student, I thought it would be a good way to give back to the community and maybe even write about the experience for a class assignment. I arrived just before dinner service, and the shelter was bustling with activity. People milled about, some chatting quietly, others huddled in corners, lost in their own thoughts. I noticed a man in the far corner who sat alone, his face obscured by a hood. He was older, with a scruffy beard and wild hair, and he kept glancing around as if he was waiting for someone. As I served food, I overheard snippets of conversation. Some guests shared stories of their struggles, while others whispered about a man they called the Hunter. Rumor had it he had a history of violence, targeting vulnerable people who frequented the shelter. Later that evening, as I cleaned up after dinner, I overheard a group of men talking about a recent incident. They described how the Hunter had cornered a young man just outside the shelter and threatened him. The group said that nobody had seen the Hunter since then, but the tension in the air was palpable. I shook off the unease, focusing on helping where I could. But as the night wore on, I noticed the man in the corner was now standing, pacing nervously. I caught his eye, and he beckoned me over. "Can you help me?" he whispered urgently. "I need to get out of here." "What do you mean?" I asked, glancing around, trying to assess the situation. "The Hunter is here," he said, his voice trembling. "I saw him come in. He's been watching everyone." A shiver ran down my spine. I had thought it was just a story, but there was something in his eyes that convinced me he was serious. Just then, the shelter's door swung open and a chill rushed in. A tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the harsh streetlight outside. My heart raced as the man's hood fell back, revealing a gaunt, hollow face, eyes gleaming with a predatory intensity. It was him, the Hunter. Panic surged through me as I watched the figure scan the room, his gaze settling on the man who had warned me. I turned to the staff, but they seemed oblivious, focused on cleaning and chatting. "Run!" the man hissed. "We have to get out now!" I hesitated, torn between fear and the instinct to help. But as the Hunter stepped further inside, my instincts kicked in. I grabbed the man's arm and pulled him toward the emergency exit at the back of the shelter. We stumbled into the alley, and I could hear the Hunter's footsteps echoing behind us. The man led me down a narrow passage, his breath quickening as we turned corners, but I could hear the Hunter's heavy footsteps growing closer. "This way!" he urged, pointing to a dimly lit doorway. We burst inside, slamming it shut behind us. We found ourselves in an abandoned building, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. "What now?" I gasped, looking around. He pressed his back against the door, heart racing. "We need to stay quiet. He'll know we're in here." We crouched in the shadows, listening as the Hunter approached. I could hear him outside, murmuring to himself, frustration lacing his voice. "I know you're in there!" he shouted, banging on the door. "You can't escape me!" My heart raced as the realization hit me. He was a predator, and we were his prey. The man beside me trembled, fear etched on his face. I reached for my phone, praying for a signal, but there was none. The Hunter's voice grew louder, taunting us. "You think hiding will save you? You're mine now." I glanced at the man beside me. "We have to find another way out," I whispered, desperation creeping into my voice. As we moved deeper into the building, the sound of the Hunter's footsteps echoed closer, sending us into a panic. We darted through the crumbling hallways, searching for a way out, but every exit seemed blocked or chained shut. Finally, we reached a window. It was small but open to the outside. "Help me," I urged the man, my heart pounding. "We can escape." He nodded, and we pushed together, managing to pry it open just as we heard the door burst open behind us. The Hunter's shadow loomed large as he stepped into the room. "You can't run from me." I squeezed through the window first, hitting the ground hard but rolling to my feet. I turned just in time to see the man hesitate, fear holding him back. "Come on," I shouted, but he looked back at the Hunter, frozen in place. With a sudden rush of movement, the Hunter lunged toward him. I reached out my hand. "Jump!" But it was too late. I watched in horror as the Hunter grabbed him, pulling him back into the darkness. I bolted, my heart pounding, stumbling away from the building. I didn't look back, but I could still hear the man's screams echoing in the cold night air. I made it to the street, gasping for breath, shaking with fear. I ran until I reached my car, heart racing. I drove away, unable to shake the image of the man I had left behind. I reported the incident to the police the next day, but they found no trace of the hunter or his victims. I never returned to that shelter. The memories of that night haunt me. How quickly kindness can turn into horror, and how dangerous the shadows of the city can be. I had just moved into my new apartment, eager to start fresh after a rough breakup. The place was small but cozy, with a vintage charm that I loved. I quickly set about unpacking, and when I came across a large ornate mirror left by the previous tenant, I decided to hang it in the living room. The first few days went smoothly. I settled in and even invited a few friends over for dinner. As we laughed and shared stories, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching us. Whenever I caught a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye, the reflection seemed slightly off, as if something lurked just beyond my sight. One night, I was alone, curled up on the couch with a book, when I heard a faint tapping sound. I glanced at the mirror and felt a chill run down my spine. There, in the reflection, stood a figure, a shadowy silhouette that seemed to be staring directly at me. I shook my head, blaming fatigue. "Just my imagination," I muttered. But the tapping persisted. It grew louder, a rhythmic sound that echoed in the silence of my apartment. I rose to investigate, heart pounding. I approached the mirror and touched its surface, feeling a strange vibration beneath my fingers. Suddenly, the tapping stopped, and I caught a glimpse of something moving in the reflection. The figure was closer now, its face obscured. I stumbled back, fear gripping me. "Who are you?" I shouted, but the reflection didn't respond. Instead, it smiled, a slow, sinister smile that sent shivers through me. Panicking, I turned to run, but the mirror seemed to pulse, drawing me back. I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck, and the whisper of a voice echoed in my ears. "Stay with me." I fought against the pull, darting away from the mirror and slamming the door to my living room. I spent the night barricaded in my bedroom, too terrified to sleep. When morning finally came, I gathered my things and fled the apartment, leaving the mirror behind. I never looked back, haunted by the feeling that something dark had been waiting for me in that reflection, something that wanted me to stay. It was late, and I had just missed the last train home. The streets were deserted, and I felt a pang of dread as I spotted an old bus idling at the stop. The sign flickered, and its headlights cast an eerie glow on the pavement. Reluctantly, I approached, hoping the driver would let me on. The door creaked open, revealing a single passenger, an elderly man, hunched over in his seat. I climbed aboard and took a seat near the front, eyeing the driver cautiously. He wore a cap pulled low over his eyes, obscuring his face in shadow. The bus rumbled to life, and we rolled away from the station. As we traveled deeper into the night, I glanced around the dimly lit interior. The elderly man stared straight ahead, his fingers drumming rhythmically on his knees. An unsettling feeling settled over me, and I wondered if I should have waited for the next train. After a few minutes, the bus took a sharp turn down a dark road I didn't recognize. "Where are we going?" I asked the driver, but he didn't respond. Instead, the man beside me turned his head slowly, revealing sunken eyes and a toothless grin. "Going to a better place," he rasped, the words sending a chill through me. I forced a nervous laugh, trying to ease the tension, but my heart raced as the bus continued to veer off course. I pressed the button to signal my stop, but the driver ignored it. Panic rose in my throat. "Please, let me off!" I yelled, but the bus just rumbled on, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife. The old man leaned closer, whispering, "You can't escape once you're on board." My stomach dropped as I realized I had made a grave mistake. Suddenly, the bus screeched to a halt, and the driver turned his head, revealing a twisted grin that sent shivers down my spine. "This is your stop," he said. Before I could react, the door swung open, revealing a darkened landscape, overgrown with weeds and shadows. I bolted for the exit, my heart pounding, but the old man grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "You don't want to leave," he hissed. I wrenched free and leaped off the bus, running into the night. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station, breathless and terrified. When I looked back, the bus was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I never caught another late-night ride again. group of friends and I decided to go camping in a secluded area by the lake. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, laughter, and sharing ghost stories around the campfire. As night fell, we gathered around the crackling fire, the flickering flames illuminating our faces. "Let me tell you about the campfire killer," one friend began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "They say he roams these woods, looking for campers who stray too far from their sight. If he finds you, you're never seen again." We laughed nervously, dismissing it as just a story. But as the night wore on, the air grew heavy with tension. I felt uneasy, glancing into the darkness beyond the firelight. "Come on, it's just a story," my friend said, tossing another log onto the flames. But then we heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. Our laughter faded, replaced by a thick silence. "Probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound brave. But deep down I was scared. The rustling continued, growing louder like footsteps crunching on leaves. Suddenly we spotted a figure emerging from the shadows, a man in tattered clothing, his face obscured by a hood. He approached slowly, hands tucked into his pockets. "You all camping out here?" he asked, voice gravelly. We exchanged uneasy glances. "Yeah, just for the weekend," one friend replied, forcing a smile. The man stepped closer, a hint of a smile creeping onto his lips. "You should be careful. This place isn't safe after dark." The tension in the air thickened as he continued to linger. I felt my heart race as he began to tell us stories that mirrored what we had just shared around the fire, but with a darker twist. "Last week I heard screams coming from over there," he said, pointing into the woods. "Some campers never came back." Fear settled in as we glanced at one another, silently debating whether to leave. But before we could move, the man's demeanor shifted. His smile faded, replaced by a predatory look. "You shouldn't joke about things you don't understand," he said, his voice lowering to a dangerous growl. In that moment we understood. This wasn't just a chance encounter. He was the embodiment of our campfire story. Without thinking, we scrambled back toward our tent, adrenaline pumping. The man lunged after us, laughter echoing in the night. "You can't run from me." We reached the tent, fumbling to zip it shut, hearts pounding in our chests. Outside, we could hear him circling, taunting us with whispers. We huddled together, terrified, until dawn finally broke, and the man was gone. We packed up in silence, knowing we had escaped a nightmare that felt all too real. Growing up, my friends and I loved exploring abandoned places. When we heard about an old house rumored to be haunted, we decided to investigate. The house stood at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, vines crawling up the cracked walls. As we approached, a chill ran down my spine. The front door creaked open at our touch, revealing a dusty interior frozen in time. Shadows danced on the walls, and the air smelled stale and musty. We wandered through the rooms, making jokes to mask our unease. But the further we ventured inside, the more the atmosphere shifted. The house felt alive, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something. In the dining room, we found a long table set for a feast, plates and silverware covered in dust. It looked like it had been abandoned mid-meal. We exchanged nervous glances, and I felt a shiver race down my spine. "Let's split up and search for the haunted part of the house," one friend suggested. Against my better judgment, we agreed. I took the upstairs while the others stayed on the main floor. The second floor was even creepier, with peeling wallpaper and empty rooms that felt suffocating. I wandered into what appeared to be a child's bedroom. A faded teddy bear sat on the bed, its button eyes staring blankly at me. Suddenly, I heard a creaking sound behind me. I turned, but no one was there. I shrugged it off, but my heart raced. I moved toward the window, peering out into the overgrown yard when I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows. I squinted, trying to focus, but whatever it was disappeared behind a tree. Just as the anxiety began to subside, I heard a child's laughter echoing through the hallway. It sent a jolt of fear through me. I hesitated, wondering if my friends were playing a trick, but it felt too eerie, too unsettling. "Guys?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the unsettling sound of my own heartbeat. I turned to leave the room, but the door slammed shut with a loud bang. Panic surged as I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" I shouted, pounding on the door. The laughter grew louder, more sinister, and I could feel the air around me grow colder. I backed away, feeling my way along the wall, searching for a window. As I turned, I caught sight of a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. A little girl in a faded dress, her face obscured by tangled hair. "Play with me," she whispered, her voice soft but chilling. "Where are my friends?" I asked, my throat dry. She tilted her head, and for a moment I saw her smile, a wide, unnatural grin that sent chills racing down my spine. "Come and play," she repeated, taking a step closer. I stumbled backward, frantically searching for a way out. The laughter echoed all around me now, filling the house with an oppressive weight. The anxiety began to subside. I heard a child's laughter echoing through the hallway. It sent a jolt of fear through me. I hesitated, wondering if my friends were playing a trick, but it felt too eerie, too unsettling. "Guys?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response, just the unsettling sound of my own heartbeat. I turned to leave the room, but the door slammed shut with a loud bang. Panic surged as I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out!" I shouted, pounding on the door. The laughter grew louder, more sinister, and I could feel the air around me grow colder. I backed away, feeling my way along the wall, searching for a window. As I turned, I caught sight of a figure standing at the far end of the hallway. A little girl in a faded dress, her face obscured by tangled hair. "Play with me," she whispered, her voice soft but chilling. "Where are my friends?" I asked, my throat dry. She tilted her head, and for a moment I saw her smile, a wide, unnatural grin that sent chills racing down my spine. "Come and play," she repeated, taking a step closer. I stumbled backward, frantically searching for a way out. The laughter echoed all around me now, filling the house with an oppressive weight. Finally, I spotted a window at the end of the hallway. I dashed toward it, adrenaline coursing through my veins. As I reached for the latch, I heard a scream from downstairs. It was my friend. "Help! Get out!" he yelled. And that was all the motivation I needed. I flung the window open and climbed out, hitting the ground hard but not caring about the pain. I glanced back at the house just in time to see the little girl standing at the window, her face pressed against the glass, still grinning. I sprinted down the driveway, my friends meeting me in the yard. "What happened?" I gasped. "We need to get out of here," he said, fear evident in his voice. We ran without looking back, the laughter and whispers of the house following us, echoing in our minds long after we had escaped its grasp. We vowed never to return, haunted by the chilling memories of the night we dared to enter the abandoned house. After losing my job, I found myself living on the streets. I was desperate for a warm meal and a safe place to sleep, so when I heard about a shelter nearby, I decided to give it a try. The place seemed welcoming enough, bustling with people seeking refuge from the cold. That night, as I settled into a corner with my meager belongings, I noticed a strange man lurking near the entrance. He had a wild look in his eyes and muttered to himself, sending chills down my spine. Despite the bustling activity, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. As the night wore on, I tried to sleep but was constantly awoken by the man's erratic behavior. He would pace back and forth, his whispers growing louder, like a chant. I could see other residents staring at him, their faces twisted in fear. In the early hours of the morning, a loud crash jolted me awake. The man had thrown something against the wall, shattering the stillness of the night. The shelter staff rushed to restrain him, but his strength was unnaturally fierce. He broke free, darting toward me with wild abandon. "Help me!" he screamed, eyes wild with terror. "They're coming for me!" Before I could react, he grabbed my wrist, pulling me with him. I stumbled, trying to break free, but his grip was ironclad. "You don't understand. They'll take us both." Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the other residents began to panic, scrambling to find an exit. I caught glimpses of shadowy figures materializing in the corners of the room, their movements fluid and predatory. "Look!" I shouted, pointing toward the shadows, but when I turned back, the man was gone. Panic erupted as people pushed and shoved to escape. I joined the chaos, my heart racing, desperate to find safety. Outside, the night was eerily quiet. I turned back, but the shelter stood ominously still, its windows dark. The chaos inside had subsided, leaving only an unsettling silence. As I wandered away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out. I could hear whispers behind me, echoing in the stillness. I had escaped the shelter, but I would never escape the memory of that night, or the strange man who warned me of the darkness within. It was a cold night when I found shelter in an abandoned lot behind an old warehouse. The concrete walls provided some protection from the wind, and I wrapped myself in layers of discarded clothing. As I settled in for the night, I heard the distant sound of sirens, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I thought. Suddenly, I noticed a flickering light in the warehouse. Curiosity piqued, I crept closer, careful to stay hidden. Peeking through a broken window, I saw a group of homeless people gathered around a makeshift fire. They were huddled together, whispering, their faces illuminated by the flames. As I watched, I noticed a man standing apart from the group. He had a gaunt face, and his eyes seemed to glow in the firelight. I felt a chill run down my spine as he raised his hand, revealing a small, blood-stained object. "Tonight we feast!" he declared, his voice booming. The others cheered, and I realized with horror that they weren't just cooking food. They were preparing a meal from something far more sinister. Heart pounding, I turned to leave, but a twig snapped underfoot. The group turned their gaze toward me, eyes filled with a mixture of hunger and curiosity. The gaunt man grinned, his teeth sharp and menacing. "You're just in time for dinner." I bolted, sprinting through the lot and back onto the street, but I could hear their footsteps behind me. "Get her!" the man yelled, and I could feel their breath on my neck, hot and rancid. I darted into an alley, searching for a place to hide. The darkness swallowed me, and I pressed against a wall, trying to control my breathing. The echoes of their laughter echoed around me, mocking my fear. "Where did she go?" one of them shouted. Suddenly, the gaunt man appeared at the alley's entrance, blocking my only escape. "You can't run forever," he taunted, taking a step closer. Desperation flooded through me as I searched for a way out. I spotted a dumpster and scrambled inside, hoping it would conceal me. The voices grew louder, the laughter chilling. They passed by, their conversation fading into the distance. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me, but I could still hear the gaunt man's voice, lingering in the air like a dark omen. I was safe for now, but I knew I would never return to that lot. The darkness had claimed its victims, and I had narrowly escaped becoming their next meal. I had been living on the streets for weeks, trying to survive day by day. One evening, as I settled down on a park bench, I noticed a woman sitting nearby. She appeared to be in her 50s, her clothes tattered but clean. She stared straight ahead, a distant look in her eyes. I didn't think much of her at first, but as the night wore on, I noticed her glancing at me. "You look like you could use a friend," she said softly. I hesitated but felt an odd sense of comfort in her presence. We started talking, and she told me her name was Clara. She spoke of her life, her family, and how she ended up on the streets. The way she described her past was both haunting and beautiful, but as the conversation deepened, I noticed her demeanor shift. "There are places in this city that aren't safe," she warned, her voice low and serious. "You need to be careful, especially at night." I nodded, trying to absorb her words, but a sense of dread settled in my stomach. "Why do you know so much about danger?" I asked. Clara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Because I've seen things no one should ever have to witness." I felt a chill run down my spine as her gaze turned intense. "You have to understand. There are creatures that walk among us, hiding in the shadows. They prey on the lost, the desperate." I laughed nervously, dismissing her words as the ramblings of a woman who had lost her mind, but her expression didn't waver. "They'll come for you if you're not careful." Suddenly, she leaned closer, whispering, "You must leave this place, trust me." Before I could respond, she grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the park's edge. "Go, don't look back!" I hesitated, confusion washing over me, but then I heard faint whispers behind me growing louder. Clara pushed me away, her face a mask of fear. "Run!" I turned and fled, the whispers growing into frantic shouts. I glanced back and saw Clara standing alone, her eyes wide with terror. I ran until I reached a safe distance, my heart racing. As I caught my breath, I turned to look back at the park, but it was empty. I never saw Clara again, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had watched us both that night, something that had driven her to warn me. For weeks, I had been sleeping under a bridge, surviving on the scraps I could find. One day, I stumbled upon a large piece of graffiti on the concrete wall. It depicted a monstrous figure looming over a city, and beneath it were the words, "They are watching." I felt a strange pull toward the mural, but an unsettling feeling settled in my gut. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a piece of urban art. As the days passed, I began to notice more graffiti around the area, each one depicting twisted figures and dark phrases. One night, as I lay under the bridge, I was awoken by the sound of scratching. I opened my eyes to find shadows moving along the wall, twisting and writhing in the dim light. I felt a cold breeze sweep over me, and the hairs on my arms stood on end. Trying to shake off my fear, I looked closer at the mural, and for the first time I realized the figures seemed to change every time I blinked. They appeared to be reaching out, as if trying to escape the wall. I backed away, my heart racing. The next night, I returned to the spot, unable to resist the pull of the mural. But this time, the figures looked even more desperate, their expressions twisted in horror. I noticed something new, tiny glimmering eyes among the shadows, watching me. Suddenly, a chilling voice echoed in my mind, "Join us!" I stumbled back, fear gripping my heart. "What do you want?" I shouted into the night. "Help us escape," the voice whispered. "We need a vessel." I ran, the shadows lunging toward me as I fled back to the bridge. The walls felt alive, closing in around me. As I reached safety, I looked back to see the graffiti pulsing, the eyes filled with a dark hunger. That night, I couldn't sleep, haunted by the voices. I decided to leave the area for good, but even as I walked away, I felt their eyes on me, their whispers trailing behind. I may have escaped that bridge, but I knew I would never truly be free. The shadows would always watch, waiting for the right moment to claim me as their own. I was struggling to find shelter in the city, wandering aimlessly until I stumbled upon a rundown diner that was still open late at night. The flickering neon sign seemed like a beacon of hope. I entered, the warm air wrapping around me like a comforting blanket. Inside, the diner was almost empty except for the waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, and a man hunched over in the corner booth. He was dressed in ragged clothes and seemed out of place, staring into his coffee as if it held the answers to life. I approached the counter and ordered a cup of coffee. As I sipped the steaming liquid, the man's gaze lifted to meet mine. He motioned for me to join him. "You look lost, kid. You need something?" he asked, his voice gravelly but calm. "I just need a place to stay," I replied, the weight of my situation hitting me harder in the light of day. The man leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "I can help you, but it'll come at a price." I hesitated, unsure of what he meant. "What kind of price?" "Your soul," he said, grinning. The way he smiled revealed teeth stained brown as if he had chewed on something foul. I laughed nervously, but the man's expression didn't change. "I'm serious. You want a warm bed and food? You'll owe me." The diner felt suddenly colder, and I could sense the waitress glancing at us, her expression wary. "Just think about it," he said, leaning back. "You could have everything you ever wanted, but once you make the deal, there's no turning back." I pushed my coffee away, feeling ill. "I'm not interested." As I turned to leave, I felt a grip on my arm. The man's eyes glinted with madness. "You'll come back. They always do." That night, I wandered the streets, the man's words echoing in my mind. Days turned into weeks, and I found temporary shelters. But I always felt the shadow of his offer looming over me. Then one night, I returned to the diner, hoping to confront him. But when I arrived, it was gone. The entire block had been cleared, leaving only the ghost of the diner behind. I realized I had narrowly escaped a fate worse than living on the streets. I had escaped a life bound to darkness. Living on the streets had hardened me, but nothing prepared me for what happened that fateful night. I had just settled into a cardboard box behind an old movie theater when I heard laughter. Curiosity piqued. I peeked out and saw a group of people gathered around a small fire playing a game. They seemed carefree, drinking and joking, and I felt an urge to join them. I approached cautiously, and one of the guys, a tall fellow with a wild beard, welcomed me. "Hey, come on, we're just playing some games. Join us." They called it the game. The rules were simple. Each person took turns drawing cards from a worn deck. Based on the card drawn, you had to share a secret or perform a dare. The atmosphere felt electrifying, and I quickly became swept up in the excitement. When it was my turn, I drew a card with a joker. "What does that mean?" I asked, feeling a mix of excitement and anxiety. "Jokers are special," the bearded man said. "You have to dare someone to do something. But if they refuse, there are consequences." I scanned the circle, landing on a girl with haunted eyes. "I dare you to tell us the scariest thing you've ever done." She hesitated, her voice shaky. I used to live in a house where people disappeared." Everyone laughed, but her expression was serious. She continued, describing a house where she had once lived, filled with whispers and shadows. "One night I went into the basement, and I saw them, people trapped. I ran, but I heard them calling for help. The atmosphere shifted, a chill running through the group. I couldn't help them," she whispered, her eyes glassy. Suddenly, the lights from the nearby theater flickered, plunging us into darkness. I heard scuffling sounds, and when the lights returned, the girl was gone. Panic set in, and we all scrambled to leave. As I ran, I could hear whispers echoing around me. "They need help," they called, beckoning me to return. I escaped into the night, but I could still hear them, urging me to come back, pulling me toward the darkness where they had disappeared. I never returned to that spot, terrified of the consequences of playing their game. I had been living on the streets for months, but one night I found a group of homeless people gathered around a fire in a hidden part of the park. They welcomed me, sharing food and stories. I felt a sense of belonging, something I hadn't experienced in a long time. As the night wore on, they began discussing their community. They had rules, strict but fair, and a promise of safety in numbers. I felt drawn to their way of life, a tight-knit family forged in hardship. They invited me to stay, and I accepted, eager for camaraderie. But there was a darkness that lurked beneath their kindness. They often spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the shadows. I soon learned about a sacrifice they performed each month to protect their community. One evening, they explained that a newcomer would have to volunteer to ensure the safety of the group. My heart raced as they looked at me expectantly. "It's a simple ritual," one of them assured me. "You'll be safe." Curiosity turned to dread as they led me to a clearing deep in the woods. There, an altar was set up, decorated with strange symbols and offerings. I felt the weight of their eyes on me, an intensity that made me uneasy. "Tonight, we protect our own," one said, stepping forward. "We need someone brave to ensure we stay safe from harm." I wanted to run, but I was trapped by their expectation. "What do I have to do?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "You'll give us your fear," another said, stepping closer. "We'll take it from you." Before I could protest, they began chanting, surrounding me as the world blurred. I felt an overwhelming wave of terror crash over me, as if my very soul was being pulled from my body. I could hear their voices, urging me to give in. With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free from the circle, sprinting into the darkness. I could hear their chants growing louder, chasing me through the trees. I escaped that night, but their words haunted me. They had wanted something from me, something dark and twisted, and I knew that if I ever returned, the darkness would claim me. After losing everything, I found myself sleeping on a park bench, trying to avoid the eyes of passers-by. It was a rough existence, but I managed to keep my head down and stay out of trouble. One evening, while I rummaged through a nearby trash can for food, I noticed a figure watching me from a distance. He was an older man, wearing a long trench coat and a hat that shadowed his face. I could feel his gaze, heavy and penetrating. I brushed it off, thinking he was just another passerby, but as the days passed, he kept appearing at the same spot. One night, he approached me, his voice low and gravelly. "You're not safe here, you know." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "There are dangers lurking in the shadows. You should leave before it's too late," he warned, his eyes darkening. I chuckled nervously. "I can handle myself." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of something foul. "You don't understand. I've seen what happens to those who don't listen. They vanish." A chill crept down my spine, but I dismissed his words. The next night, I decided to confront him, hoping to get some answers. As I approached, I noticed something unsettling. The park was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of the city felt muffled, as if the world had gone still. The man was gone, but I could see faint shadows moving in the corners of my vision. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I turned, but nothing was there. The unease grew, and I could feel a cold breeze brushing against my neck. I decided it was time to leave, but as I walked away, the whispers began. Soft at first, then growing louder, echoing in my ears. "Stay with us." Panic surged through me, and I started to run. The shadows chased me, stretching and reaching as if trying to pull me back. I felt breath on my neck, a sensation of being hunted. I escaped the park that night. But the whispers never faded. They haunted my every step, reminding me that I had ignored the warning of the man in the trench coat. I was never truly free. I was marked by the darkness that lingered, waiting for the right moment to reclaim me. I've been living on the streets for a while, trying to find ways to survive. One cold evening, I found a hidden corner behind an old library, a small alcove where I could curl up and escape the biting wind. It felt like a safe haven, far from the prying eyes of the city. As I settled in for the night, I noticed another figure lingering nearby, a young woman, her clothes tattered and her face drawn. She approached cautiously, introducing herself as Mia. We quickly struck up a conversation, sharing stories about our lives and struggles. There was a bond in our shared misfortune, a sense of camaraderie that felt rare in our harsh reality. But, as the nights passed, I started to notice something unsettling about Mia. She often stared blankly into the darkness, her eyes vacant and unfocused. When I asked if she was all right, she'd brush it off with a laugh, but there was a tension in her smile that made my skin crawl. One night, while I was trying to sleep, I heard a faint whispering. It was Mia, speaking to herself in the dark, her voice low and frantic. I turned to see her with a wild look in her eyes, mumbling about them watching her. Fear gripped me. I wasn't sure if she was mentally ill or if something else was going on. The next morning, I found my belongings rummaged through, the little I had left in disarray. Mia had vanished, and a lingering dread settled in my chest. I decided to leave the alcove and find a new place to stay. As I wandered through the city, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder often, convinced that Mia or someone else was trailing me. I ended up back near the library, my heart racing as I saw her standing in the shadows, her gaze fixated on me. "Mia!" I called, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly moved toward me, a twisted smile stretching across her face. "You can't escape," she whispered. I ran, adrenaline surging through my veins. I didn't stop until I reached a busy street, blending in with the crowd. I never looked back, but I couldn't forget her haunting presence, a reminder that sometimes the darkness holds more than just shadows. After losing my job and apartment, I found myself on the streets, often staying near a small park where other homeless people gathered. One evening, while digging through a trash can for scraps, a well-dressed man approached me. He looked out of place, his expensive suit contrasting sharply with the gritty surroundings. "Hey, I see you're having a tough time," he said, concern etched on his face. "I can help you get back on your feet." Skeptical, I eyed him warily. "What's the catch?" "No catch. I work with a charity that helps people like you. We provide job training and housing assistance." He handed me a business card. "Come see me at the office tomorrow." Despite my doubts, I felt a flicker of hope. I showed up the next day and he welcomed me with open arms. He introduced me to a small group of people, all promising they would help me find work and a place to stay. As the days passed, I noticed something strange. They started asking probing questions about my life, where I had been, and why I ended up on the streets. I felt uncomfortable but brushed it off as part of their help. One evening, the man invited me to a meeting at an upscale restaurant. I was nervous but excited. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt wrong, too sterile, too perfect. The people who welcomed me looked like they were straight out of a glossy magazine. During dinner, they began discussing cleaning the streets and how they could help people like me. As they spoke, I realized they weren't talking about job training or housing. They were discussing their plans to push homeless individuals out of the area. I was horrified. Suddenly, I felt trapped. The man from the park turned to me with a chilling smile. "We're here to help, but sometimes that means making tough choices. Fear surged through me as I stood up to leave. The group laughed, their eyes glinting with something sinister. I slipped out of the restaurant and ran into the night, knowing I had narrowly escaped a nightmare masked as kindness. Living on the streets is a brutal existence, and I learned quickly to be wary of strangers. One evening, while huddled against a cold wall, I noticed a group of homeless individuals gathered around a fire, laughing and sharing food. They seemed welcoming, and my stomach grumbled at the smell of something cooking. As I approached, a man with a scruffy beard waved me over. "Come join us, we have plenty to share." Reluctantly, I sat down, grateful for the warmth. They offered me food, and as I ate, I felt a sense of camaraderie. They shared stories about their lives, their laughter echoing through the night. But as the evening wore on, I sensed something off. The group's laughter took on a mocking tone, and I noticed the way they exchanged glances. They began asking me probing questions about my past, my struggles, and I felt their interest shift from friendly to predatory. "Why don't you come stay with us?" one of them suggested, a sinister smile creeping across his face. "We have a place not far from here." I hesitated, feeling the weight of their gaze. "I'm fine here," I stammered, but their laughter grew louder. They began to push me, insisting I needed their help. In a moment of desperation, I agreed to go with them. They led me to an abandoned warehouse, its windows boarded up and darkness swallowing the space. Inside, the atmosphere shifted from jovial to menacing. They surrounded me, laughter fading into hushed whispers. "Welcome to our little family," one of them said, revealing a knife hidden in his jacket. Panic surged through me. I bolted toward the exit, but they blocked my path, laughter echoing in my ears as I pushed past them. I stumbled out into the night, heart racing, and ran as fast as I could, their taunts chasing me through the darkened streets. I learned that night that not everyone on the streets is a friend, and sometimes the allure of belonging can lead you straight into a trap. Having hit rock bottom, I sought refuge on the city streets. I often stayed near an abandoned lot where a small community of homeless people gathered. One night, as I settled in with my meager belongings, I noticed a man lurking in the shadows. He had an unsettling presence, always watching but never approaching. Days turned into weeks, and the shadowy figure became a constant in my life. I felt his eyes on me, sending chills down my spine. Whenever I tried to talk to other people in the lot, he'd step closer, looming in the background. I tried to ignore him, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier with each passing day. One evening, I decided to confront him. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice steady despite my racing heart. He stepped into the light, revealing a gaunt face and hollow eyes. "I just want to help," he said, a twisted smile creeping across his lips. "You don't belong here. You should come with me." Fear coursed through me as I shook my head, backing away. "No thanks." As the days passed, the man's presence grew more intrusive. He followed me everywhere, whispering about how he could make my life better. It felt like a sick game, and I was the unwilling pawn. One night, desperate to escape, I left the lot and headed toward the city center, hoping to lose him in the crowd. But he was relentless, appearing in the shadows no matter where I went. I could feel his breath on my neck as I walked faster, panic setting in. Finally, I darted into a small alley, my heart pounding. I thought I'd lost him when suddenly he stepped out from behind a dumpster. "You can't run from me," he hissed, the madness in his eyes sending me into a frenzy. I ran, not looking back, weaving through the streets until I found a police officer. Breathless, I explained my situation. They promised to help, but when we returned to the alley, he was gone. The haunting feeling of being hunted never left me, a constant reminder that sometimes the shadows lurking just behind you are far more dangerous than they appear. I used to take a different route home through the park every night after work. One evening as I walked, I noticed a homeless man rummaging through trash cans, collecting various items. At first, I thought nothing of it. He was just a guy looking for valuables. But as days passed, I saw him every time I took that route. He wore layers of dirty clothes, and his wild eyes scanned the ground as if searching for treasures. One evening, He approached me as I passed by. "Hey, you dropped something!" he yelled. I hadn't, but I stopped, curious. He held out a small, broken watch. "You dropped this, right?" I shook my head, but he insisted. "It's a nice watch. I found it by the dumpster." Something about his intensity made me uneasy, but I thanked him and walked away. The next night, I noticed he was following me. I picked up my pace, trying to lose him, but he stayed close, his gaze fixed on me, whispering things under his breath. I could hear snippets. "You're special," and "I'll take care of you." Panicking, I ducked into a nearby convenience store, hoping to lose him. As I waited inside, I could see him through the glass door, pacing back and forth. My heart raced as I thought about what he might do. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to leave through the back exit. I was almost to my car when I heard him behind me. "I told you, I'll take care of you," he shouted. I sprinted to my car, fumbling with the keys as he got closer. Just as I jumped in and locked the door, he reached for the handle, his face inches from mine, eyes wild with something I couldn't comprehend. I revved the engine and peeled away, shaking. That was the last time I took that route home. I received a terrifying offer from a homeless woman. It was a chilly winter evening, and I was leaving my job at a local diner. As I walked to my car, I noticed an elderly homeless woman sitting on the curb, bundled up in ragged blankets. Her eyes seemed to pierce through the dim streetlight as she stared at me. "Please, can you spare some change?" she asked, her voice raspy. I reached into my pocket and handed her a few coins. Instead of thanking me, she leaned closer, whispering, "I can help you. I know things." "Things?" I replied, confused. "Things about your future. You want to know if you'll be safe?" Her eyes sparkled with a strange intensity. I chuckled nervously, thinking she was just trying to entertain herself. "No, I'm good. I just need to get home." But she gripped my arm, surprisingly strong for her age. "You don't understand. There are dangers lurking. You need my help." Something in her tone sent chills down my spine. "What do you mean?" She leaned closer and I caught a whiff of something foul. "There's someone watching you. Someone who wants to hurt you. But I can help you for a price." "Price?" I asked, backing away slightly. "Just a small favor. I need you to get something for me." "It's in the dumpster behind the diner," she said. "No way. I'm not digging through garbage for you." Her expression shifted. "You don't want to know what will happen if you don't." I felt a surge of fear and decided to leave. "Thanks for the info, but I'm out." As I turned to walk away, I heard her yell, "You'll regret it!" I rushed to my car, heart pounding. I didn't look back until I was safely inside, locking the doors. The woman's words echoed in my mind. For weeks afterward, I felt uneasy, constantly checking my surroundings, convinced I was being watched. At approximately 9:30 p.m., I received a call about an altercation at Central Park. Upon arrival, I found a group of individuals gathered around a homeless man who appeared agitated and aggressive. Witnesses reported that the man had been playing a game with passers-by. He would ask them to answer riddles, claiming that if they failed, they would suffer dire consequences. One victim, a young woman, approached me with a look of fear. "He asked me a riddle," she said, visibly shaken. I couldn't answer it. He got angry and started yelling. It felt like he was going to hurt me. As I spoke with her, the homeless man noticed us and began shouting, "You can't escape the game. You'll regret it." His demeanor escalated, and he started pacing, eyes wild with anger. I attempted to calm him down, but he continued to rant about the rules of his game. "You think you're better than me? Answer the riddle," he screamed, pointing at me. Realizing the situation could turn violent, I called for backup. The man lunged at me, and I had to restrain him. With the help of other officers, we managed to subdue him. After detaining him, I learned that he had been living in the park for several months and had exhibited erratic behavior. He was taken to the station for evaluation. In the aftermath, several witnesses expressed relief, but there was an air of unease. This incident served as a reminder that not all homeless individuals pose a threat, but there are those whose instability can escalate into genuine fear for others.